Megyn Kelly is in the news for her comments about the January 6th riots at the Capitol. Kelly said, quote, "It wasn't an insurrection, and also there is no question the media represented it as so much worse than it actually was."
Joining us now to discuss is editor-in-chief of The Real News and host of Working People podcast, Max Alvarez, and senior editor at Reason, Robbie Suave. Welcome to both of you.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Great to see you guys.
So, Robbie, I'm going to start with you. I think two things can be true on this point. First, what happened at the Capitol on January 6th can be absolutely horrific. I actually tweeted this. It can be absolutely horrific. And at the same time, it can be true that the media is overplaying how horrific it was. So that they can be getting the scale wrong and something can still be horrific. What do you think about the backlash to what Megyn Kelly said?
Yeah, I think the backlash is fairly silly. I listened to her longer sentiments too, and I agree with them. So I was there. I went to cover it, the January 6th riot, and I was horrified by what I saw. Mobs of people smashing windows, engaging in violence against the police, and it was really bad. And we shouldn't, undersell that this was really bad. That said, I mean, there were lots of mob attacks all last summer. There were buildings burned to the ground. People smashed windows in Washington, D.C. when they were part of the far left, and the media didn't have much in the way of this is the worst thing that has ever happened in all of human history to say about that. I was kind of disturbed by all examples of violence and property destruction and vandalism and mob behavior, and I'm really against it. And it's frankly annoying that kind of both sides want to excuse it when it's their people and then say this is worse than 9/11. This is worse than the apocalypse when it's the other side. There's no consistency on this.
I was going to say just quickly, I was there covering it as well, and we did just literally see Steve Schmidt, establishment Republican strategist of the Lincoln Project, the discredited Lincoln Project, literally saying that January 6th was worse than 9/11. He said that last week. Every time I look up at MSNBC, they're replaying footage of it. So that's the sad thing about this, is that it was horrific, but then the media is just milking it for partisan purposes to the last drop.
And the irony is that on the day that it happened, the media was actually underplaying it significantly, and so was social media. If you remember, the takeaway at the end of the day was this video of Capitol Police kind of moving one of the gates that was keeping protesters out of one particular part of the Capitol complex. And so the narrative was, the police just kind of stepped aside. And you also had the images of the selfies being taken inside the Capitol. It wasn't until later that night and the next day and the day after that people started recognizing how violent it actually had been. But for the grace of the Capitol Police not opening fire, it didn't turn more deadly than it was. I mean, obviously they did open fire in one instance, and Ashley Babbitt was killed. But so I kind of agree from both directions there. But Max, I'm curious about your take on the word insurrection. There's a whole camp of people that say you shouldn't call this an insurrection. This is just a bunch of yahoos. On the other hand, to me, an insurrection is organized political violence against a piece or a symbol of the state apparatus. So I would even say that when the police station in Minneapolis was burned down, that's an example of insurrection. It doesn't mean it's a revolution and that they're going to overthrow the government, but it's organized political violence against the state, whether it's yahoos or not. But I'm still thinking this through. What's your read on describing this as an insurrection or an attempted insurrection?
Well, I would start by saying that as someone on the left who has watched countless protests and demonstrations get misrepresented by the media, focusing only on a smashed window or something like that in order to delegitimize the entire thing, I guess you'll forgive me for being a little less than sympathetic, and I would actually call a big fat BS on the media. The media gives left-wing protesters a pass. That ain't true by a mile, and the police don't give left-wing protesters the kind of pass that they gave the Capitol rioters themselves. So I'd say let's pump the brakes. But having said that, that makes me, at least more sympathetic in the vein of I inherently am sort of skeptical of the way that the media portrays things like this. And so I think that there is a discussion to be had. And the main thing is that, like, let's not kind of gaslight people into believing that they didn't see what they saw, right? I mean, we can have a fine-grained discussion here, but I'm only going to participate in that if we acknowledge, like, that what we saw with our own eyes was, in fact, what happened, right? We can't just kind of minimize it completely. I think the question of insurrection is a really important one, right? In order to figure out, like, what the significance of the Capitol riot actually was, right? Because Ryan, we actually had a version of this debate on the left, right? I mean, there was a lot of discussion after the Capitol 6 riots about whether or not this was fascism, right? One side was kind of saying, like, see, we told you so, right? This was always where the Trumpist movement was going. This is always what it was capable of, and so on and so forth. The other side was really stressing that if these are the teeth and muscles of the fascist movement that Trump represents, then the threat was never really that big in the first place, because they didn't take over the government, right? It was comprised of a number of yahoos and petty bourgeois, business owners and LARPers and stuff like that. So clearly the fascist threat was never as big as, like some on the left made it out to be. This was the kind of terrain of the debate. And I would say, like, my perspective on that and my read on the question of insurrection, right, stresses the fact that, in order to understand this, we can't look at it as just like a singular sort of event outside of the broader context of what Republicans and especially Trump, have kind of built up, like, the sort of capacity for over decades. Rick Perlstein actually had a great piece in New York Magazine recently that really resonated with me as a former conservative who grew up listening to right-wing talk radio, right? There is a sort of synergy on the right that the left and the Democratic center do not have. A synergy in which the sort of culture industry that is constantly kind of playing to, the interests, fears, and anxieties of its base, that feeds it. There are pathways that feed that frustration into the parliamentary wing of the right-wing project. And you saw that in the Capitol Hill riots, right? At the same time that there were Trumpist yahoos trying to storm the Capitol, there were over 140, senators and members of the House who were trying to vote to kind of overturn the election itself. And they were fueled by a, media machine that incorporated both sides of these into a larger sort of project to keep Trump from having the election stolen from him, right? The Democratic Party does not have any interest in sort of stoking and channeling the kind of same activist energy of its base into its parliamentary wing. It has more of an interest of tamping it down and saying, let the adults in the room take care of it. So that's an important distinction I think we should make here.
Sure. Robbie, do you agree with that distinction? Do you agree with Max's point about the synergy?
I'm not sure about that. I think there's I'm not sure that activist energy, if you're talking about, like, some of the loonier far-right activity, I mean, what they did at the Capitol did not serve the Republican Party's electoral prospects well. I think Donald Trump has substantially lowered his possibility of ever being reelected by the shenanigans and what it caused from the right. I think the Democratic Party does try to tamp down sometimes leftist activism because they know it's bad for the party. They know it turns off a lot of people. There's this progressive, elite capture of the media, of the news. I'm sure not to the extent my fellow panelist here would like to see, but there's so much sympathy for a much more liberal version of the country than actually exists. And so the Democratic Party knows it can win by being very moderate and, catering to the older, moderate, religious voters. And I mean, that's what Joe Biden did, and it was wildly successful. So there's a reason to not listen to activists, I think, on both sides. And really, the Republican Party, the Capitol riots was an example of the Republican Party letting its smaller activist sliver kind of get away with something that they should not have allowed to happen.
Right. I do think that, just to underline Max's key point here, the link between the parliamentary wing of the Republican Party and the far right activists, I think, was thoroughly demonstrated by, as Max said, by their votes, because their votes didn't come before. The votes didn't come before the Capitol was ransacked. They had to step over the blood of the people who had died there to come back to the House chamber, which covered in broken glass, to then cast their votes again, to overturn the election. That to me was the almost the more extraordinary moment, because that was the moment where the parliamentary wing of the Republican Party could have said, you know what? We need to step back from the brink. We all need to come together. Instead, in the House and in the Senate, you have Ted Cruz stand up and continue to object. And that, to me, was striking. And I think people shouldn't overlook that link just because the foot soldiers of this movement might have heart disease. Yeah,
well, I don't think those Republicans would, would do it over again and want the riot to have actually happened and think that it would have fueled their vote or made their vote more politically palatable. But on that note, we have to wrap. We appreciate both of your time and both of your insights this morning. Thank you so much, Max and Robbie.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
So next on Rising, we have an update on the protests taking place in Cuba with reporter Reed Lindsay. Stick around for that.